From Asia Society Switzerland, this is State of Asia. My name is Nico Luchsinger. 2024 has been called a super election year, with more than 50% of the world's population being called to the polls. The biggest election by far is in India. Of its 1.4 billion inhabitants, 950 million are eligible to vote in the elections for the lower house of parliament, the Lok Sabha. The elections start this week and conclude on June 1st, with all results being announced on June 4. And just as an aside, the logistics of this election alone are mind-boggling. There's 1 million polling stations, 15 million workers, and over 400,000 vehicles involved. Indian politics is always good for a surprise, but it is very likely that the coalition centered around Prime Minister Narendra Modi's BJP will win these elections, giving Modi a third term as Prime Minister. He would be the first Prime Minister not from the Congress party serving a third term. And while there has been a lot of reporting on the story and political acumen of Modi himself, there has been a lot less focus on the party he leads, the BJP. That party has gone through a remarkable transformation in the last years and is now the world's largest political party with over 170 million members. I visited the headquarters of the BJP in Delhi early last year, and since then I've been wanting to understand the party and its success better. And the book that everyone's been pointing me towards was written by political scientist and journalist Nalin Mehta. It is simply called The New BJP, and over more than 800 pages offers a magisterial account of the rise of the party. Mehta looks at the party as a whole, its history, its ideology, its structure and organization, the way it broadened its voter base, and the way it uses digital tools for communication. It's a fascinating and wide-ranging book. And Nalin Mehta joins me today to offer insights on the party that is likely to govern India for 5 more years, at least. Just a quick note before we get started. We had some technical issues and had to record this conversation in 2 parts, so Nalin and I might sound a little bit different towards the end. Nalin Mehta, welcome to State of Asia.
Thank you very much, Nico, and lovely to be here.
So Nalin, I think there's somewhat of a narrative around the BJP and Prime Minister Modi here in Switzerland and in the West, in Europe, that goes something like this. The main reason the BJP has risen into power and been able to stay there is due to the political acumen of Narendra Modi himself, and because the BJP, is pandering to Hindu nationalist sentiments and is kind of repressing democratic and civil freedoms. How accurate is this narrative that we seem to hear quite often?
So I think this is a very simplistic narrative. I think it's a narrative that's very easy to propagate because it kind of fits many people's mental maps. But what's happening in India with the rise of the BJP, with the rise of Hindu nationalism, and of course the enduring electoral popularity of Narendra Modi as Prime Minister. He's now finishing 10 years in power as Prime Minister. He's been in elected office for over 20 years now, and he's yet to lose an election that he's fought in the last 20 years. Now, the simple fact is that the narrative with the liberal intelligentsia in India, as well as with the global intelligentsia, and if you read the New York Times, for example, it is that this is a rise of a xenophobic, populist leader and of an ideology which is taking India back into autocracy and so on. And I think at the heart of this narrative is that there's something wrong with these electoral victories. I think the fact of the matter is, number one, there's no question that Narendra Modi has been the harbinger of change for Hindu nationalism and its electoral popularity in India over the last 10 years. There's no question about that. The BJP used to be among the 2 most important political parties in India before 2014. It is by far the single most important political party in India. It is also by far the single largest political party in the democratic world. The only other party that was bigger than the BJP till recently was the Chinese Communist Party, but that doesn't count because it's not in a democratic system. But the BJP is now bigger than the Chinese Communist Party in size. And that is important when you put this in context. The Chinese Communist Party exists in a state which is a one-party state. The BJP exists in a state where over 50% of India still did not vote for BJP and Narendra Modi in the last election, in a country which is a multi-party democracy. That's number one. Number two, I think it's too simplistic to say that this is entirely because of Hindu nationalism. There's no question that Hindu nationalism is at the heart of the BJP's ideology. There's no question that the BJP stands for an unapologetic Hinduness, if you like, of strong nationalism and of a idea of India which is different from the idea of India that preceded it. There's no question about that. However, the fact of the matter is that the BJP has been winning not because the core constituency of Hindu nationalism has increased. What has happened is it's been winning because the BJP has been getting many more unaligned voters cutting across gender, class, geography, and caste. So, for example, since 2014, the BJP has won more elections than it ever did before 2014. And even when it has lost elections, it has done better in them than it did before. And the reason for that is that the BJP in North India, for example, Hindi speaking North Indian states, they constitute a significant majority of these. The BJP has become by far the predominant party of the village in North India. It's also become the default party of the poor in North India, which is very different from pre 2014 BJP, the old BJP as I call it, used to be a party which was a party of urban India. It was a party of people in the towns, not in the villages, of upper castes, not lower castes, and of the rich and the middle classes. It wasn't a party of the poor, it wasn't a party of a much wider social diversity, and it wasn't a party of the village. The BJP post 2014, which is the new BJP, which Narendra Modi has kind of created, is by far the most socially representative party in North India, barring Muslims. And that's an important exclusion because large numbers of Muslims do not vote for the BJP. But keeping that aside for a second, across caste, class, gender, the BJP has been getting more votes than any other political party. And that is not because of cultural nationalism, it is because of other issues. It is because of things like the creation of a new kind of a welfare state. It is because the creation of a new social welfare delivery system, which has been enabled by technology. It's the coming together of the unique ID system, a phone mobile revolution in India, and a rewiring of the Indian welfare state as we know it, and the bringing into the welfare net of large amounts of people that were completely outside of it. And that importantly, it's also because of gender. More women in India today vote for BJP than for any other political party, which is completely different from 10 years ago. Historically, in India, for about till the early 2000s, women mostly voted for the Congress and not for the BJP. That equation has changed completely. So, this is why the BJP is rising. To pin it down just to one person or to pin it down to just cultural factors would be simplifying it to the point that it won't make any sense.
Thank you very much. And you've already, I think, covered a lot of ground. The incredible book that you've written achieved is that it's very clearly teases out all these different elements that have contributed to the BJP's rise, and would love to go a little bit deeper on some of them. You quote a BJP official in the book who says Hindu nationalism may have been something that has helped accelerate the BJP's rise, but the real drive was this focus on welfare. And I'd be curious to hear from you. Focusing on welfare seems like a fairly obvious political strategy to win elections, especially in countries where there's still a relatively large share of the population living in poverty. But it's one thing to want to do that, and then it's another thing to actually do this successfully and turn it into electoral success. So what was the key success factor in the BJP's focus on welfarism? How did they do it, and how did they do it in a way that helped them succeed politically?
All governments spend money on development in the developing world. The BJP is no different. What has happened is the delivery mechanism has changed completely, and that changes everything. And let me illustrate this a little bit. In the 80s, Rajiv Gandhi, the former Congress Prime Minister, he had famously argued that for every rupee of development aid that goes to the poor, only 15 paisa of that rupee reaches the poor. 100 paisa makes a rupee, only 15 of that 100 would reach the poor. The rest would be lost in between in transit due to corruption through different levels of governmental bureaucracy. Now, what has happened is that Mr. Modi's government and his politics has benefited significantly from the coming together of the unique digital ID system, of a phone revolution in India, and cheap data. What happened is that India, as you know, has the single largest unique ID system in the world called Aadhaar. About 1.4 billion people have digital ID systems, which didn't exist before. This would have meant nothing on its own if India didn't have a mobile phone revolution. So almost every Indian now has a mobile phone, almost every Indian. And data costs, by the way, data consumption in India is per capita is more than any other country in the world. It's more than North America, it's more than Western Europe. And it's at the cheapest rates in the world. So that allowed the poor to access cheap data and the internet in a way that just wasn't thinkable even 5 or 6 years or 7 years ago. That's number one. Now, keeping that in mind, what Mr. Modi did when he came to power, and this precedes Mr. Modi coming to power, and the government that preceded him between 2009 to 2014, the unique ID system was created by the Congress government of that time, along with Nandan Nilekani, who's one of the IT tycoons of India, who created one of the co-founders of the IT company Infosys. It was created at that time both as a security tool as well as a tool possibly for social welfare and as a digital ID system. What happened with that was that Mr. Modi, by the way, had publicly opposed that system when he was the chief minister of the province of Gujarat before he became prime minister. By the way, the Congress had started a pilot project for direct benefit transfers of welfare money to the poor in 51 districts of India before it lost power. And the idea was that instead of developmental money going through different schemes to people or through different layers of governmental bureaucracy where it was prone to be siphoned off due to corruption, the idea was that the money could go directly from the government's bank into the people's pocket through the mobile phone, through an online transaction. Now, there were two or three problems in this idea. The first problem was that India did not have financial inclusion. 80% of Indians before 2014 did not have a bank account. So even if you identified all of them, where would you give them the money? You couldn't transfer it digitally, right? They didn't have a bank account. So that was the first problem. The second problem was that the Indian state had no way of identifying the poor with exactitude. It knew roughly how many poor there were, but the problem always was how to reach them directly, which is why a lot of money used to get siphoned off. What the digital ID system did was it allowed India to first create financial inclusion. So between 2014 to in about a 3 to 4 year period, India brought into the banking system about 550 million people who never had bank accounts. And that meant that financial inclusion in India went from 25% to about 80%. No other country in the world has seen such a large shift in financial inclusion in such a small period. That happened basically because this coming together of the cheap mobile phone, the cheap data, and the unique ID system allowed the state to issue a directive, which Mr. Modi did. That was his first action after taking power in 2014, and that allowed people to join the banking system, and then the state could have a way of reaching them. The second thing that Mr. Modi did was that he put his entire political capital, and remember, he won 2014 with a huge, massive majority. The first time a political party had won absolute majority in our parliamentary system in over 3 decades was in 2014. Mr. Modi was the first prime minister in over 3 decades who won an absolute majority of his own in 2014, and he repeated that with an even bigger majority in 2019. And now we're heading into a third election in 2024. Now, in between 2014 and 2019, when these bank accounts were created, he also put his political might behind direct benefit transfers. And what that meant was, I'll give you some numbers. The number of beneficiaries was only 100 million in 2013-14. That went up to 748 million in 2022-23 in the people who received government aid directly into their bank account. If you're on social welfare in the US, you still largely, my American friends tell me, you still largely get money through a check. So this is what India did in a 4 or 5 year period. So at one level, the government saved over $27 billion by savings across government schemes. At another level, billions of dollars of money reached people's pockets. And I'll give you an example of what this means. And this example includes gender, which is very important because women voting is fundamentally crucial to the rising political fortunes of the BJP. The government started a scheme for housing for the poor. Millions of people in India who are poor, below the poverty line, did not have their own houses. So they were living in shanties, or they were living in houses that weren't made of brick. So the government said, we will create a scheme where we will provide you X amount of money to build a house, but we will not build a house for you. There were previous schemes also before this that used to provide housing to the poor. In fact, the critique of the government or opposition has often been that Mr. Modi didn't do much. The critique has been that look, he just took older schemes, gave sexier names to those schemes, and publicize them better. So this whole thing is a chimera, it's a myth. Now that is not true. Between 2014 to 2019, 20 million plus houses were built in India by the poor through money that came to them through their mobile phones from government funding. Similarly, over 165 million toilets were built. Now, this is very important because one of Mr. Modi's two signature schemes was free housing for the poor, and the second was toilets. Many villages in India do not have toilets in their houses, so women have to go into the fields for bathing or for going to the washroom. And there was a lot of issues of sexual harassment in the open fields. Now, when 165 million toilets are built, how are they built? The money is sent to the account of these women who never had bank accounts before, and they make the toilets themselves in their own house. So that completely changed gender equation on the ground in many places. And the other point, last point I want to make is these 20 million houses that were built, the government mandated. India is a deeply patriarchal country, as we know, by all gender data tells us that. This is a country which did not have inheritance rights for women until 20 years ago. For example, if my parents passed away and I had a sister, I would inherit the house from my parents, not my sister. She would have no right on my parents' house in the way that I would have. Only in the early 2000s, the Supreme Court of India gave that right to my sister, but that right was given for people whose parents died from that date onwards. It wasn't for people whose parents died before that. Now, only 2 or 3 years ago, that right was given to all people, irrespective of when their parents died. In such a patriarchal country, the government of India mandated that these houses which are being built for the poor, the preference will be given to women, not to men. So what happened was that out of the 20 million plus houses that were built, 68% of that 20 million happened to be registered in the names of only women alone or women jointly with their husbands. Imagine about 13 to 14 to 15 million women who had very little voice in their home in the village in a deeply patriarchal society, now getting a house which they've never owned, and they are the owner of that house and not their husband. It changed the power equation socially in many ways. This was a huge step for gender equality. Now, a significant proportion of these women who got houses registered in their name like that, I think it's reasonable for a lot of them to try and vote for the BJP at least once to see what has happened. Because the BJP then also mobilized political opinion by reaching out to people below the poverty line and saying, look, we gave you this housing. This creation of a new kind of a welfare state, which was significantly more efficient than the welfare state that preceded it, I think is very much at the heart of the BJP's growth as a party of the village and of the poor.
Thank you. One thing that I think for the first time you've actually shown in your book through what I can only imagine was very tedious data analysis is that the BJP also expanded in terms of the castes from a much broader background, and there's a lot more representation of lower caste than there used to be. The BJP was actually known kind of as an elite upper caste party. And again, here, it's kind of obvious that a political party who strives for power would want to do that. But what I'm fascinated by is that it seems that the BJP was able to expand its appeal and its representation among lower castes without experiencing the backlash from the existing party elite and the upper caste. It was able to broaden the tent without paying a price for it. How did it do that?
So, like you said, the BJP before 2014, the old BJP, was an upper caste party. It was a party of the elites. It was largely an urban based party. What the BJP did was that after Modi comes to power, and in fact, part of and along with Amit Shah, who was the Home Minister and Mr. Modi's lieutenant, what they did was, what we found in our research was, this is something that I didn't expect. I'm a political junkie, I followed Indian politics all the time, but this is something I didn't expect to find. In fact, I didn't believe my own data when I first saw it, because what we did was we studied the social profiles of members of parliament elected to India's parliament from different political parties over a 40-year period from 1970 onwards till 2020. Then we looked at the party organization of the BJP at the district level down to the lowest level to see who are the people who have positions of power and influence within the party's hierarchical structure. And then we looked at the people who, after the party came to power, who were the ones who got the spoils of power. So who, i.e., who became ministers. So parties can promise many things to many people, but after they come to power, who do they reward? Did they just make empty promises? Or did they actually, to include people in the social tent, as you called it? Or did they then give these people an equal share in power or not? That was the idea, to study it across all these matrices. And what we found in the data completely stunned us. It was that, contrary to the old stereotype of the BJP, what the BJP did was that After 2014, the BJP systematically went and significantly increased the participation of three kinds of the Dalits, which is the former untouchable castes in India, at one level. The second is of something called the other backward classes. What the BJP did was that it systematically went to the guys in the middle, the guys in the lower middle, and the guys at the bottom of the table, and the old traditional caste hierarchy table, and it told these guys, look, hey, we will give you a stake in our system. Why don't you join us, and we'll give you positions of power. So now this is a very difficult thing for the BJP to do, because if you see Indian politics for the last 70 years now, there was a after independence in the 1940s, the Congress party dominated Indian politics for the longest time, and the Congress party was a social umbrella. It was a party of the freedom struggle against the British. It had a social umbrella tent where almost everybody from every walk of life, every religion, every caste was part of the Congress. So it was, it was like a hold all party for everybody. When the Congress party declined, it was replaced not by another party that was similar to it for between the early 1990s to 2013-14, which is the period before precedes the BJP coming to power. In that period, there were largely two forces that controlled Indian politics. One was the rise of Hindu nationalism as one pole. It wasn't very dominant, but it was a rising axis of power where people who identified themselves as Hindu culturally and politically started moving towards the BJP, but they were largely restricted to the upper classes at that point, or the upper castes. And then the second pole was the rise of the caste-based parties, the parties of social justice. And these parties basically argued that over so many years of independence, while we may have had independence on multiple levels, the old Congress system basically still continued the old caste hierarchies, and the lower caste, those lower down the traditional order, never got the political due. So these parties were organized around the axis of caste, with the BJP mobilized around the axis of religion and culture. And then there was a Congress which claimed to be the party of everyone. So there were these three basic poles, and there was a fourth pole which was regional sub-nationalism, if you like, because India's got many languages and many states, and there are parties who kind of espouse the local, regional, sub-nationalist interest of those regions. These are the four kinds of broad divisions in Indian politics. What the BJP did was, in North India, which is the base of the BJP's power. In North India, the power was basically it was the caste-based parties and the parties of which espouse social justice, which largely were winning many of these seats at the expense of the Congress. What the BJP did was it went to the supporters of the caste-based parties and told them that, look, you guys have been hoodwinked for 30 years in the name of giving you more power. The leaders of these parties have essentially become feudal, family owned parties, and actually they never give you power. The BJP basically said, look, we will give you power if you come to us. And what we found in our research was that systematically at every level of political power, at the level of party organization, at the level of people who were given tickets at the national and provincial levels, at the level of people who then made ministers after they win elections, the BJP significantly increased its share of people from these communities to somewhere which is close to the population average of these communities. So what that meant, and the amazing thing in this was, it did this without losing the support of the upper castes who remained with the BJP. And it also did this. So this was at the center of the BJP increasing into rural India. And that was crucial to its growth. The BJP by far became the most socially representative party by caste in North India at every level of political power that matters in North India.
You've outlined really well, Nalin, how the BJP has been incredibly successful in expanding from what used to be an elite upper caste party into all different sorts of classes and castes. But that does beg the question, also looking at the example of the Congress party, going forward, can the BJP make sure that it serves the interests of all the people that are involved in the party, or will it be torn apart by diverging interests of stakeholders?
There's no question that this is going to be a challenge for the BJP as it grows bigger and bigger. But that really is a test of its leadership. So far, we've already seen signs of some of these challenges. But so far, the current leadership led by Narendra Modi has managed them adroitly. But under a weaker leadership, when the wheel of electoral fortune changes, and the leadership is not as secure at that point, then these issues will become more and more acute. So at the moment, for example, one of the reasons why the BJP can manage to override some of the tensions of tussling or the tussles for control between different factions is that because the BJP is still growing, is still winning elections constantly. So that allows the leadership to paper over the cracks that may or may not may appear a little bit, simply because the leadership is still giving more to the party than is taking from it. But as and when the wheel of fortune changes, then these challenges will become more acute.
We started our conversation with you arguing that this idea that Hindutva, Hindu nationalism, is the central or even only reason for the BJP's rise is way too simplistic. But I do want to come back to this topic because Hindutva is central to the BJP. And you describe it in the book as sort of as the antithesis to the Nehruvian idea, whereas Nehru wanted to build a new India influenced by Western ideas. The BJP and its predecessors focused on what you call rebuilding India based on its own heritage and traditions. So with the BJP now firmly established as the leading party in India, as you've outlined, and the country itself playing a much more important role globally, what does that mean for the priorities of what is a very, very likely third term of the Modi government? What will they focus on and what would they like to achieve in the next 5 years of government?
So I think one of the big priorities for the government will be economic growth. First and foremost, India is already the fifth largest economy in the world. Mr. Modi has set a target for India becoming the third largest economy in the world. The focus on that, a focus on much more investments. So that's one. Secondly, I think in cultural terms, we will see a deepening of the focus on culture as an ID. Essentially, this is an unapologetic cultural nationalism, a focus on nationalism, an India that will be significantly upfront globally in its diplomacy as its global heft rises. It'll be less apologetic about than it has been in the past for multiple things, and very vocal about its concerns, which is also a sign of its rising confidence. But also, that messaging is both global as well as internal, because it's meant to also showcase certain kind of strength to its internal audiences.
Excellent. Nalin Mehta, thank you very much for joining us on State of Asia.
Thank you very much, Nico. A great pleasure to be here.
I'm now joined by my colleagues Serena Young and Remco Tanis to talk about the conversation I just had with Nalin Mehta. Hi both.
Hello.
Hi.
Serena, how has this changed your view on India and the BJP?
It raised a few more questions. I think he did a fantastic job of explaining how the success and the diversification of the voter base Modi and his party approached. But looking back at how they came to power in 2014, right, it was like the promise of jobs, which was a mixed bag. And the 2019 results were also a big success, mostly on the Hindutva thing, I think. And now they managed to somehow bring the foreign policy on the top of everybody's mind. And 2024 seems like the vote of India as a superpower. I found that interesting. And I wonder what the next 5 years will bring, honestly, because Hindu nationalism is still continuing. I'm wondering what that brings about, because if you think about it, if they increase the discrimination of their Muslim minority, that may affect foreign policy as well.
Remco, what have you learned from this conversation about the world's largest political party?
Oh, it's funny you posed a question like that to me, because that's the first thing I was thinking. He compares, well, it is the single largest political party in the democratic world, but even outside of that, he says, well, it's larger than the Chinese Communist Party. It's never really a very productive way to polish your own image if you compare yourself to a Chinese Communist Party. But other than that, I do agree with him saying that the narrative we might have, that it is a bit simplistic to think that the BJP only got where it is today in the past 10 years because of its nationalist streak. In the end, Indians, like voters everywhere, and even people who don't vote, just want to see their life improve steadily, want to get agency, and they'll vote for the party that delivers that. And the BJP has apparently been doing that.
Based on Nalin's book, I tried to kind of tease out 5 elements of the BJP's rise. The 4 I think we addressed are Hindu nationalism, Hindutva. He is absolutely right that I think this gets maybe slightly overvalued or overplayed sort of in our view on India, but it's definitely there as a reason. I thought it was very interesting what he said about welfare. Again, I think that's something that we maybe ignore or tend to not give as much relevance to as we should. That's strongly connected to the third one, which is the women vote. Again, I think what the BJP has achieved here is remarkable, is to get a majority of the women vote within 10 years. And then the last one, of course, is caste mobilization and inclusion. And he did say, again, I think that's something that just as a statement is important to keep in mind. The BJP is the most socially representative party in Northern India with the exclusion of Muslims. That's an important exclusion. He did say that, but I think it does go a bit against a view that I think many still have of the BJP. It's kind of as an elitist project. And I think the reason they were successful is precisely because they stopped being an urban elite thing. The fifth element that we didn't really talk about in the conversation and that I also find hardest to grasp is party organization and structure. And I did actually visit the headquarters of the BJP last year in Delhi. And it was this amazing, big, but also I think like well-structured complex. It was I think the one thing that I noted walking away was sort of how on brand this organization is, how everything, from the sign at the entrance to the rooms to the notebook that they gave me to take with me sort of had very consistent BJP branding. And I think that's important. I think regardless of what you think about the BJP, it cannot be easy, and I think we should sort of take it as a monumental achievement to build an organization as 175 million members and seems to be run in an incredibly efficient and effective way.
I think it's also increased by the chaos that seems to be the opposition, right? The leaderlessness that they display. Also, the short moment last year where the opposition coalition India evolved and counted a few successes, it just crumbled again since then, right?
And there's also not really signs that Congress and sort of the opposition alliance would sort of become a lot more powerful. So I think for now, the BJP really is not just the largest political party in the world, but it is the undisputed dominant political force in India for the foreseeable future.
I thought another way in which, you can't help but compare China and India when Nalin at the end said that he wouldn't be surprised if a priority for Modi's third term would be to give India an unapologetic and much more strong and dominant voice on the global stage. I mean, I'm all for countries having agency, and especially a country like India, which is massive, should have probably a stronger voice than it currently has. But especially that word unapologetic, I was like, that never really helps with stability that we don't have in the world anyways.
One thing I'm surprised hasn't come up yet in this conversation is the role that digital technology has played in all of this. I've been broadly aware of the development of what is usually referred to as DPI, digital public infrastructure in India, so the Aadhaar, the identification system, and then the payment layer, which is called UPI, that was built on top of that. I know that these things exist, and I knew that they were developed relatively quickly and that the rollout was considered a huge success. But I didn't kind of put that development together with the rise of the BJP and sort of this massive expansion, but also the massive increase in effectiveness and efficiency that Nalin sort of talks about in terms of the welfare programs that the government has. I think that's something that for us is maybe hard to see and understand, that the fact that there's an easy, transparent, fast, in quotation marks, corruption-free way to receive money to go build a toilet in your house is super important. It's an important political factor that will and probably also should affect the decision on who you vote for.
There's another way to compare with China here, because I felt highly reminded of the conversations we had around the social credit system, where we always said, how can they welcome, the people in China welcome the social credit system in a way that we think is probably dangerous. Mm-hmm. And it's a way to build trust in a low trust society, and it's a way to prevent corruption.
And didn't the BJP also, as not just have like on a government level, they have the digital public infrastructure, but the party itself also built an app last year or something, right? That just goes into the finest grains of society and of their members to communicate with them, to keep them updated about whatever. Guess what other major political party also has an app? Anyway, that's for another day maybe.
And that's all for this episode of State of Asia. We'll be back in 2 weeks. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe to State of Asia wherever you get your podcasts. You can find a full transcript of this and all previous episodes on our website, asiasociety.org/Switzerland. That's where you also find information on the many events and activities we organize, and where you can subscribe to our weekly newsletter. Please consider becoming a member to support the work we do. We appreciate it. Thank you so much for listening. My name is Nico Luchsinger. See you next time.